In the heart of the 20th century, the world placed its faith in medicine, believing that healing hands could do no wrong. Yet history reveals a darker narrative, where doctors wielded their knowledge as instruments of suffering. The very institutions designed to protect the vulnerable became sites of compliance and authority. Within sterile walls, compassion could be overshadowed by the demands of obedience, leading to choices that defied the Hippocratic Oath. As the medical community advanced, it often blurred the line between healing and harm. The quest for knowledge and progress sometimes eclipsed the ethical considerations that should have guided their actions. This unsettling contradiction raises a profound question. How did the guardians of health become agents of cruelty? The answer lies in a systemic failure where authority and trust were exploited. Throughout history, there have been moments where the calm demeanor of medical professionals masked their complicity in suffering. These were not random acts, but calculated choices made within a flawed system. In the pursuit of progress, the medical field often prioritized results over reflection. The consequences of these decisions rippled through communities, leaving scars that would last for generations. The quiet nature of these failures makes them all the more insidious. The most destructive harm can wear a calm, professional face, making it difficult for society to recognize the danger lurking within. As we delve deeper into this unsettling history, we must confront the uncomfortable truth. The very systems that were meant to heal sometimes chose to harm. How did this happen? The journey ahead will explore the choices made by those in power and the consequences that followed. What led trusted healers to abandon their moral compass in the name of progress? In the early 20th century, as cities expanded and populations grew, faith in scientific progress surged. Medical professionals, clad in white coats, were revered as the guardians of health, their authority seldom questioned by the public. The triumphs of medicine, such as the discovery of antibiotics and vaccines, fueled public trust. Patients willingly submitted to treatments, believing that their doctors always acted in their best interest, even as ethical boundaries began to blur. With each breakthrough, the medical community grew more confident, often prioritizing results over ethical considerations. The promise of progress became a justification for actions that would have once been deemed unacceptable. As medical institutions expanded, the pressure to deliver results intensified. Doctors, once seen as healers, began to navigate a landscape where compliance and obedience were rewarded, overshadowing the moral questions that lingered. Patients, often unaware of the complexities of medical decisions, placed their trust in the expertise of their doctors. This blind faith created an environment where questioning became rare and dissent was quietly discouraged. The rise of institutional medicine brought with it a new language, one that favored data over human experience. Doctors began to frame their decisions in terms of efficiency and outcomes, sidelining ethical considerations. As the public's trust deepened, the medical establishment grew increasingly insulated from scrutiny. The line between healing and harm began to blur as the pursuit of knowledge took precedence over compassion. In this climate, the ethical implications of medical practices became secondary to the desire for progress. The belief that science could solve all problems led to a dangerous complacency among practitioners. As the trust in science solidified, so did the potential for misuse. The very authority that promised healing became a tool for manipulation, setting the stage for a troubling evolution in medical ethics. In the early 1940s, a chilling rationale began to take root among medical professionals. The notion that suffering could be justified for the sake of progress emerged, cloaked in the language of necessity. Doctors, once seen as healers, began to view their actions through a lens of scientific advancement, where the ends began to justify the means. As the war intensified, the urgency for medical breakthroughs grew. In laboratories, researchers began framing painful experiments as essential to national strength. The suffering of a few was rationalized as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good, a sentiment echoed in hushed tones among colleagues. Doctors like Dr. Helen Fisher, a middle-aged woman with short, dark hair and sharp green eyes, found themselves caught in a moral quandary. As she reviewed data from her latest experiment, the lines on her forehead deepened. reflecting the internal struggle between her ethical beliefs and the pressure to produce results. The language of morality began to fade, replaced by metrics and outcomes. Doctors justified their actions with statistics, convincing themselves that any pain inflicted was merely a stepping stone toward a greater understanding of human health. Doubt was seen as a flaw, a weakness that could undermine their progress. In the shadows of ethical debate, the idea of informed consent began to erode. Patients became subjects. Their autonomy diminished as doctors rationalized that the pursuit of knowledge outweighed individual rights. The once sacred bond between physician and patient transformed into a cold transaction. As the experiments progressed, the narrative shifted further. Doctors began to see themselves as soldiers in a battle against disease, justifying their actions as necessary for the survival of their nation. The moral compass, once a guiding principle, became a tool for rationalization. The pressure to deliver results intensified, leading to a culture of compliance. Those who questioned the ethics of their actions were often silenced or marginalized. The collective pursuit of knowledge overshadowed individual conscience, creating an environment where moral ambiguity thrived. In this climate, the distinction between right and wrong blurred. The language of justification seeped into every corner of the medical community, where the pursuit of advancement overshadowed the fundamental principles of care and compassion. The consequences of this shift were yet to unfold. As the search for justification continued, the implications of these choices loomed large. The medical community stood at a crossroads, where the path forward would demand a reckoning with the very values that had once defined their profession. The question remained, how far would they go in the name of progress? In the early 20th century, a chilling shift occurs as certain groups are deemed suitable for medical experimentation. Vulnerable populations, including prisoners and minorities, are classified as expendable subjects, their humanity overshadowed by bureaucratic labels. As the language of medicine evolves, individuals are reduced to mere statistics. The once vibrant identities of patients fade, replaced by diagnostic codes and classifications that strip away their personal stories and dignity. Consent, once a fundamental principle of medicine, quietly erodes. The process becomes administrative, with forms and classifications replacing meaningful dialogue, as the vulnerable are coerced into compliance without their true understanding. In this environment, difference is weaponized. The disabled, the mentally ill, and the marginalized are seen not as individuals but as categories, their lives deemed less valuable in the pursuit of scientific advancement. As the medical community rationalizes their actions, the line between ethical practice and exploitation blurs. The language of progress becomes a shield, justifying the suffering of those deemed unworthy. The normalization of medical abuse takes root as institutions create policies that prioritize results over morality. The very systems designed to protect life become mechanisms of harm, cloaked in the guise of necessity. In this chilling reality, the voices of the oppressed are silenced. Those who dare to speak out against the injustices are marginalized, while compliance becomes the expected norm among medical professionals. As the process of dehumanization continues, the distinction between healer and harm doer becomes increasingly blurred. The very fabric of medical ethics unravels, leaving behind a chilling legacy of complicity. The consequences of this systemic failure are profound. As the vulnerable are targeted and exploited, the question remains, how far will the medical community go in the name of progress, and who will pay the price? In the early 1940s, a pervasive atmosphere of fear enveloped the medical community. Doctors, once seen as healers, now grappled with the pressure to act decisively against perceived threats. The specter of war loomed large, transforming the practice of medicine into a battleground for national security. As fears of degeneration and enemy infiltration grew, medical professionals began to rationalize extreme measures. The language of protection replaced compassion, and harmful practices were framed as necessary sacrifices for the greater good. Each decision felt justified, a step towards safeguarding society. Among them was Dr. Helen Fisher, a middle-aged woman with short, curly brown hair and sharp green eyes. Once committed to patient care, she now found herself at a crossroads, torn between her ethics and the demands of authority. The pressure to conform weighed heavily on her. The justification for cruelty was often couched in sterile terms. Doctors convinced themselves that refusing to comply with orders would be irresponsible. The incremental nature of their choices masked the moral implications, allowing them to navigate a path of complicity without overt acknowledgement. As wartime policies took hold, the medical establishment aligned itself with state interests. The line between healing and harm blurred as doctors became instruments of a larger agenda. The collective fear of falling behind overshadowed individual rights and ethical considerations. In this climate, the vulnerable became collateral damage. Minorities, the disabled, and those deemed unfit were increasingly seen as expendable. The language of protection masked a chilling reality. The sacrifice of the few for the safety of the many became an accepted norm. Dr. Fisher, despite her internal conflict, felt the weight of responsibility. She witnessed colleagues justifying their actions with cold logic, each convinced they were contributing to a noble cause. The erosion of ethics was gradual yet profound as fear dictated their choices. With each passing day, the policies of fear solidified into routine. Medical professionals began to accept practices that would have once been unthinkable. The once sacred trust between doctor and patient eroded, replaced by a chilling calculus of risk and reward. As the war intensified, Dr. Fisher faced a pivotal moment. The choices she made would not only define her career, but also echo through the lives of countless individuals. The conflict between her conscience and the demands of her profession reached a critical juncture. In the early 1940s, the line between medicine and authority blurred as governments began to dictate medical practices. Doctors, once seen as healers, became agents of state policy, bound by orders rather than ethics. As compliance became the standard, medical professionals faced a stark choice: obey or be ostracized. The pressure to conform silenced dissenting voices, leaving those who questioned the system vulnerable and isolated. With the rise of bureaucratic oversight, ethics were stripped from the practice of medicine. The focus shifted from patient care to administrative efficiency, as laws and regulations dictated what was permissible. In this environment, the concept of informed consent faded. Patients became mere statistics, their rights overshadowed by the demands of the state. Medical decisions were made without their voices being heard. The moral fabric of medicine unraveled as the hierarchy of authority took precedence over individual judgment. Doctors began to see themselves as cogs in a machine, their professional duty defined by compliance. As the war escalated, the justification for medical actions became increasingly tenuous. The language of healing was replaced by the rhetoric of duty, as doctors rationalized their roles within the system. Those who dared to challenge the status quo were often marginalized or removed from their positions. A culture of fear permeated the medical community, stifling any hope for ethical resistance. As compliance became ingrained, the distinction between right and wrong faded. The system no longer asked what was ethical. It only considered what was allowed under the law. In this chilling atmosphere, the consequences of blind obedience began to unfold. The authority that doctors once trusted now dictated their actions, leaving a legacy of ethical erosion that would haunt the profession. In the sterile corridors of a mid-20th century hospital, many doctors chose silence over dissent. They witnessed the suffering of their patients, yet remained passive, prioritizing their careers over moral responsibility. Each day, the walls echoed with the unspoken complicity of those who could have spoken out. The fear of repercussions loomed large. For many physicians, the threat of losing their positions was more daunting than the ethical dilemmas they faced. They became accustomed to witnessing cruelty, rationalizing their inaction as self-preservation, allowing the system to perpetuate its abuses. As the years progressed, the medical community became increasingly insular. Conversations about ethics faded, replaced by discussions of efficiency and results. The quiet acceptance of unethical practices became a norm, eroding the very foundation of the Hippocratic Oath. Among those who remained silent was Dr. Elias Fisher, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and deep-set blue eyes. He often recalled the faces of his patients, yet he chose to look away, fearing the consequences of speaking out against the prevailing tide of compliance. The absence of protest became a powerful enabler. Colleagues who once might have challenged unethical practices now found comfort in shared silence. The collective unwillingness to confront wrongdoing allowed the machinery of abuse to function unimpeded. Dr. Fisher's internal conflict deepened as he witnessed the suffering of marginalized patients. Each day, he felt the weight of his silence, yet the fear of losing his livelihood kept him from acting. The moral decay of his profession gnawed at his conscience. The medical establishment thrived on the compliance of its members. Those who dared to question were often ostracized, their careers jeopardized. The system thrived not on universal cruelty, but on the quiet acceptance of its members, who chose safety over morality. As the years wore on, the consequences of silence became increasingly evident. The suffering of countless individuals went unacknowledged, buried beneath layers of institutional denial. Dr. Fisher's heart grew heavy with the knowledge that his inaction was part of a larger tragedy. The moral collapse of the medical community was not marked by a single event, but by a gradual erosion of conscience. As Dr. Fisher looked around at his colleagues, he wondered if the silence would ever break, or if the cycle of complicity would continue. In the aftermath of the experiments, the medical community faced a reckoning. Some doctors were held accountable, but many returned to their practices, their pasts obscured. The silence surrounding their actions allowed them to resume their lives as if nothing had happened. As records of inhumane experiments were buried or sanitized, the victims faded from public memory. The archives of medical institutions became repositories of sanitized success, omitting the human cost. Progress continued, but at what price? Medical advancements, born from unethical practices, were celebrated without acknowledgement of their origins. The language of healing masked the reality of suffering, as the public remained unaware of the dark chapters hidden behind scientific progress. For the victims, the aftermath was marked by absence. Many families were left without closure, their loved ones erased from historical narratives. The silence of the past echoed in the lives of those who remained, carrying the weight of forgotten stories. The medical professionals who had participated in the experiments often justified their actions as necessary for the greater good. This rationalization allowed them to continue their work, shielded by the belief that progress outweighed individual suffering. While some perpetrators faced consequences, most returned to their roles, often promoted within their institutions. The cycle of complicity continued, as the system prioritized results over ethics, erasing the memories of those who had suffered. The legacy of these experiments lingered in the shadows of medical ethics. New codes and safeguards emerged, but they were often reactive rather than proactive, written in response to past failures rather than as a commitment to prevent future harm. As time passed, the narrative shifted. The focus moved from accountability to advancement, and the victims became mere footnotes in the history of medicine. The stories of suffering were overshadowed by the triumphs of science. In this climate, the question of who benefits from science remained unanswered. As the past faded, the potential for repeating history loomed, a reminder that the moral compass of medicine must be continually examined and challenged. In the aftermath of ethical breaches, the medical community faced a reckoning. New codes of conduct emerged, often written in response to past atrocities. Yet these guidelines were reactive, struggling to anticipate future missteps, highlighting the fragility of ethics under pressure. As decades passed, the legacy of past abuses lingered. Survivors, often marginalized, became advocates for change, demanding accountability and transparency. Their voices echoed through the halls of power, challenging the status quo and pushing for a more humane approach to medicine. The historical context of medical ethics began to reshape modern practices. Institutions introduced rigorous oversight, yet the risk of complacency remained. Doctors were reminded that their authority must be balanced with compassion, lest they repeat the mistakes of the past. Despite advancements, the shadow of previous failures loomed large. Ethical dilemmas arose in new forms, as technology and research outpaced moral considerations. The medical community grappled with the question of whom their innovations truly served. The legacy of compliance without conscience became a cautionary tale. Medical professionals were urged to cultivate a culture of questioning, where dissent was not only accepted but encouraged. The responsibility to uphold ethics rested on every individual. As the world faced new challenges, the lessons of history remained relevant. The medical community recognized that progress must not come at the expense of ethics. The commitment to serve humanity became a guiding principle, not just a slogan. In this ongoing journey, the relationship between science and morality was tested. Each decision made in the name of progress demanded reflection. The medical profession was called to remember that their ultimate duty was to the people they served. The story of medicine is not merely one of triumph, but of vigilance. As the past informs the present, the challenge remains to ensure that science serves humanity, not the other way around. The call to conscience endures.